So I think we've already had a very energetic morning with the key opening of the minister. We just had a nice presentation of Tesla given by Peter, which kind of already set the scene how important innovation is. And we all know it's also a big buzzword, but a very important buzzword. And well, I'd first like to know basically what are the top 3 challenges that your country is facing for the next 5 years? And well, we've heard a little bit about financial barriers, for example, perhaps on the regulatory side. So, Mr. ROJAKA, if I may start with you.
Absolutely. So when we talk about innovation, we don't talk about 5 years, we talk about decades. And I don't think that innovation is a buzzword. I think it's the only word that actually contributes to productivity nowadays. So when we talk about innovation, we definitely talk about the challenges. Innovation is something different. It's different to the strategy, it's different to the firm, it's different to the country, it's different to the regions. When we talk about challenges, first 3 things that comes to my mind are, first of all, skills. Because innovation requires totally different thinking of the old problems, of the structural problems. So reskilling people, despite we have very high tertiary education percentage, one of the highest in the European Union and among the world. We still feel that this doesn't comprehend the reality and the real demand of the market. So reskilling and retaining talents, because talents are very mobile, and to keep them within the country or within the region, because we talk about EU here, not only the country. I believe it's not only the national problem, but also the EU problem. Capital definitely is also the challenge, because to have sustainable changes, we need sustainable financing. And for sustainable financing, well, everybody should understand that innovation is risky. Innovation requires patient investors, and capital is not patient. Capital is also very mobile, and capital flows where the return is highest for the moment, not in 10 years. And innovation, when we talk about innovation, we may talk about longer terms. So capital is definitely extremely outrageously important thing. And talking about the third one, I believe is just missing the opportunity. Because innovation should be horizontal. It shouldn't be spotted in one place or in one function in the organization. It is very important that innovation be horizontal and spread. We need scope and scale to be innovative and to be most productive. But apart from these 3, I also see one of the national challenge, post-innovational challenge, maybe, that innovation creates and may create more inequality regionally. So this is a challenge we definitely need to overcome with skills and with national strategies.
Exactly, because innovation does bring along different speeds indeed. But thank you for pointing out, so reskilling, capital, very important, and horizontal innovation. Mr. Louis.
Thank you. I understand you want us to start with problems, not solutions first. So the bad news first, right? Actually, I think I would generalize, but we have only one big challenge. It's a change in the mindset. The problem is that I literally don't have companies knocking on my door saying, please help me with innovation. They still want us to help with, access to people, access to export markets. Innovation comes maybe distant 3rd, 4th, or 5th. The problem is they won't still do the same thing in a bigger scale. The thing they already know. So it's a business model problem in a way, that the classical smiley curve issue, that our country, especially in this region, I think we did very correct investments in late 90s, early 2000s, outsourcing, so that manufacturing was established, a new one, but now things have changed. Labor costs are increasing. We cannot do the same way. We have to move from the bottom of the smiley curve to the edges. So what I said about mindset, that you really need to open up and see things differently. The problem is that Estonia, like Lithuania and Latvia, we have been big exporters, but we have been very bad in selling. We don't need it to sell ourselves. The headquarters in Sweden, Netherlands, other countries, they do the selling. When I was ambassador to India, when I went there, I looked up the 10 biggest exporters from Estonia to India. I called them up, said, what are your problems? They said, oh yes, we know that we're selling to India, but we don't sell ourselves. 8 out of 10. Why it's important also because our companies haven't been exposed to the market signals. You don't get the first-hand feedback, what is necessary. That is the main driver of innovation. So this is the bad news. Also, I don't want to jump to the solutions yet, but the good news is that change is happening. What was for me extremely remarkable, what the Lithuanian minister said earlier, when he was speaking about innovation, he mostly focused on startups. He said, there are 600 startups in Lithuania that they are driving force. He wasn't so much talking about old industry, so to speak. And in a way, I agree. It's also for us a challenge. Should we focus on those new companies who want to change, have a right business model from early start, or help also the traditional companies to catch up?
Exactly.
Big, difficult question.
True, but of course you also have a role as a facilitator to bring those different mindsets together. Thank you for your contribution. Mr. EGLITIS.
Well, I'll take a look from the policy-making side on these things. So I would say that the number one challenge is the agility, because policy-making by definition is not the most agile process in the world, and we need to adapt. In order to facilitate more innovation happening, policy making has to be more agile, has to learn this agile behavior. We're trying. I hope that we're doing pretty good job in Latvia, where we have the startup law in place. This is one of the examples. We're not shy to kind of reopen that law every year, once in a while, instead of kind of common practice. Then when you launch the law, you probably let it run for a couple or 3 years and only then try to change something. So that will be one of the things. The number two thing I would say was touched by the previous speakers is still the growth of the digital divide. And it's happening actually in very many dimensions. Yep. So we have these age gaps, we have these generation gaps in terms of digital skills, we have the regional differences, we have pan-European differences. So from policy making point of view, we still must do much better job in order to create really working and operating single digital markets in European Union, in order to make a level playing field, in order to make the unified and same access for the startups to the potential new markets. And well, last but definitely not least, I will echo what was said in terms of skills and education. Yep, that's the big issue for the policy making as well. We need to create the environment where there is active, constant exchange of opinions between the industries and academia, so academia can all the time catch up with the necessities of the industries, of the startups. Because academia is kind of similar to public sector, to the government, pretty big inertia there, pretty big of share of conservative thinking.
Okay, so thank you for that. The red thread that I clearly see is the attention there should be for skills, but also to sustainable financing, access to different financial markets, and really ensure a change of mindset. And Stefana, if I may ask you to join the discussion as well. At the European Commission, you get a bulk of information, a lot of best practices and perhaps also worst practices from all the EU member states. So what can you add to the mix, where do you see opportunities to really give innovation an extra push? What is needed?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to pass judgment on the performance of different member states here, in particular with the very distinguished audience that we have now on this panel. But what I can say is that, I mean, on the basis of the interventions we heard before, and in a sector that I know very well, which is the transport sector, I think what we're seeing more and more is that there is a new wave of innovation, a wave of innovation that is not simply and purely IT. It's a wave of innovation that is now happening at a crossroads between the physical world and the IT world. This is what's happening, for example, in the world of transport. It's also happening in biotech, in energy, in many other sectors, and therefore it changes the nature of the innovations that are going to come to market and revolutionize the markets of the next 10 years. It was the time frame you were referring to. And therefore, in that context, the thinking that we have in the Commission is try to help very much that wave of innovation. And here in that context, the Baltic states have quite a strong base to compete from the fact that, of course, this new wave of innovation will be very deep tech, will be based on a very strong scientific and technological basis. So very strong universities, labs, research institutes, cooperation with corporates. And I think that is, we see clearly this bubbling happening in the Baltic region. There's a number of sectors in which those innovations are actually already happening. So therefore, from that perspective, I don't think that the Baltic states should see themselves nevertheless as lagging behind. Of course, there are a number of challenges. One, of course, is scale. Another one is access to finance, the development of the skill sets, the digital divide that is not reaching out necessarily the more traditional sectors in the economy. We have done at the level of the Commission, at the level of the Union in general, our efforts in order to help create better access to funding by putting money into VC funds that are going into, I would say, areas of the European Union that are less better served in terms of financing. This is ongoing. It's an effort that we'll plan to continue in the coming years. Of course, it's very important that the ideas and the skills that people develop are put in line, of course, with funding. But of course, what we have done also is, by launching the EIC, is try to answer the point made earlier on patient capital. We need to address more, to populate the pipeline more with greater determination at European level and help whatever emerges from our ecosystems, from our universities, from our researchers, to actually give them a chance to not only to get to market, but then to start to grow and have the possibility also, if they wish so, to grow at home and develop growth and jobs at home, which Europe has not been indeed extremely good at doing in the previous years. So this is what we will be concentrating on, and indeed, of course, the Baltic region there should really not see itself as lagging behind, but on the contrary, at having a clear chance of benefiting from this next wave that's coming up.
Okay, thank you very much. So, as the Commission, we're really trying to help to kind of cover and bridge the valley of death and to see if there are great opportunities for startups to scale up, but also to create this kind of incentives that they will stay in Europe and that they are not moving away to other continents. We'll come back to that later. I have another question. Of course, well, what we've learned also from Tesla, for example, today, sometimes you need to take risk and really make bold choices, which also means for you perhaps in your policy making that you set concrete goals, that you take specific sectors that you would like to invest in. So my question to you really is, where do you see a competitive edge for your country? So Mr. Rojaka, may I start with you?
Absolutely. So what we definitely see as a priority is there are a number of sectors, right? Pretty much with a higher value added. It's socials, it's biotechnologies, of course, it's lasers. But if we take a look on the strategies across the Europe, we will see pretty much the same areas, everyone. And we definitely live in the world of branding. So it is the national importance issue to find the niche. It's pretty much the same. So if we take the strategy of United Kingdom, for instance, or Ireland, or Germany, it's pretty much the same prioritize topics. So for Lithuania, I believe that what has been already done, and we definitely need not to forget about it, that in many countries, Lithuania goes along with fintech already. So if you ask, what do you think about Lithuania and innovation, they say, okay, fintech, or the regulatory environment.
So you've done your branding already there.
We've done branding. Estonia have done branding, right? We're trying, and it's very important not to lose this path. We definitely need those priorities, but we also need the plan B if those priorities doesn't work the same way as we have productive. And what is extremely important to point in those prioritized sectors is also to think not in 5 years, but we need to create strategy and create strategy design thinking for the strategy for the future, which is most important and most difficult thing.
Exactly, because that might be a hard assignment for you as well, because usually people are in government for 4 to 5 years, whereas you need strategies that stretch much longer than those administrative periods.
So just not only to prioritize the sectors, but find the niche, the specific subsector that you would be just great off.
Exactly. So Mr. Luby, what's your take on that? I think Mr. ROJAKA pointed out fintech, which is quite a broad horizontal area, perhaps a kind of a safe bet because you can apply it to life sciences, energy sector, you name it. What's your competitive edge?
On paper, this question is extremely right and extremely simple to answer. In reality, it's much more complicated,
On paper.
obviously. On paper, yes, because obviously this is what we need to do, especially small countries. I think Estonia is the smallest member state of the European Union who tries to fight all the battles at the same time. And this is not sustainable, obviously. We need to pick our fights and excel on those few. What are those fights? Difficult to say. European Union also has tried to help us with smart specialization policy that also governments make up their mind, do the choices. I think educational system is the key. How we can collaborate with universities and the educational system and take risks, exactly as you said. Taking risks is so important. I think I always like the good example of Singapore. They say they really bet on 2 things only that you have to study in the future, IT and art. 2 things that computers cannot do. IT, you have to program them, art is regarding design. So all the rest, don't care. We probably can't be so radical, but we have to be there. And I want to bring in another example, how to maybe right now our choices are too general. We have ICT, we have giving more added value to our natural resources and so on, but they're too general yet. So how to really narrow them down? I think one important element comes into play, and now we have to work on it. I think the Baltic states are, let's say, all other countries who are more developed than us have started to invest or invested heavily for long to applied research. We have not. So that we have basic research, and then you have already close to the market. The middle ground is missing. You need to create bridge, because otherwise you don't get the critical mass. So we have to start investing heavily there. But what JEKATERINA said, it's a risk, because the first fruits come not in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now, but you have to take a risk anyway. Yeah. So if this bridge is created, then I suppose that when we decide how we approach applied research, this element, then we make decisions also. And for example, in Estonia, we have discussion about maybe shall we go the Finnish system, VTT system, that only really focus on new ideas and new markets and new products, or we go more the Danish system that also helps everybody. Yeah. So this is the difficult choice. I was, going around it. I don't have a definite answer.
Yeah.
And if you do, please let me know. You know, we will employ you
Okay.
in the Estonian government.
Well, good luck with that, and thank you for the job offer. I'll consider that. So you take really education as your competitive edge, but at the same time, you're also pointing out there are some shortcomings, which really allude to the fact that you need to make some more investments in applied research, where there's still a gap existing. Mr. EGLITIS, what is your view?
I'd say that in Latvia, that's also one of our realizations, that we need to have this bridge between the industries and academia, employing also the deep research much better than it is now. What we are doing in order to reach this objective and some other things as well is we're taking what the European Union is providing us as a tool set, the research and innovation strategies for smart specialization framework. And we are actually marrying it with this classical triple helix approach. But what's different probably is that we are kind of doing it in a sort of managed way from the government approach. We are trying to forcefully pull together the academia, industries, startup communities, and we are fine-tuning it a little bit because we're paying specific attention to get involved our technology champions, our industry champions from different industries in the country, and we are pulling in that environment also the big international companies like Microsoft's, like Amazon's, like Roche, for example, is one of our big partners, like Beijing Genome Institute, for example. So this helps us to ensure that the potential outcome which we would generate would early enough to get a place in some sort of international value chain as the potential product. And of course, we are also getting early in the game the additional competence what we would need to create something what we actually can't think of at the moment.
Okay.
And in order to achieve that, we're kind of doing the design laboratories with these different industry players. And the interesting thing is that you're finding very nice, very fancy touch points on the meeting points of different industries. We're not going down in particular industries, we're trying to pull people together from different areas of the world. And currently, so far we've been successful in pulling together people around the biomedicine. So
Okay.
it's not particularly the cluster even, we call it ecosystem. This ecosystem now is growing and thriving. And then we have a kind of cliche word for that, we call it smart city.
Yeah.
But it consists of everything starting from the drones, including the automated traffic management, automated face recognition and AI implementations.
So you do a kind of like a thorough analysis of what kind of sectors could fit the needs well. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a small question for you before I turn to Stefan. And I'd like to ask you to raise your hands if you like to take risks for your work or business. Yeah, that's what I thought. Stefan, we have a problem in Europe with taking risks. We don't like that. So, as the European Commission, you have come up with this concept of a European Innovation Council. We have lovely financial instruments that companies will have at their disposal. But this risk-taking culture, how can we change that?
Well, I don't know. I can change it actually all by myself, you know, across an entire continent. I think the situation is changing on the ground in Europe. I think we have more and more appetite for risk. I think the problem is, at the end of the day, a problem of size in terms of how much money actually goes into more risky endeavors, in particular the ones that need patient capital over a long period of time. And here Europe is definitely lagging behind for structural reasons vis-à-vis the US that done this job basically 20 years ago and developed a very deep capital VC market that now can address this very risky end of the market, or places like Israel, or even, of course, the Asian countries that are emerging, including China. So I mean, how we catching up but not fast enough, and we certainly don't catch up with the necessary means to do so. What we are trying to do at the level of the Commission is to basically impulse and accelerate that movement by trying to put money where we believe we can make a real difference at the level of risk that usually VC companies in Europe are very reluctant still to take, or they don't have enough money to take a lot of risk, and therefore they, at the end of the day, support only a few of very risky companies. And therefore try to make a real difference there. In other words, try to populate the pipeline of startups that then the private investors are looking at, the VC market is looking at, by enlarging the pipeline with more risky companies that will feature more with a chance eventually to create breakthrough markets or to create disruptive markets in the future. So this is where we believe Europe can make a real difference. In a way, to go back to the discussion you just had, in a way that will be an equalizer as to the location and the geographies where these startups are developing and where they have the opportunities to access to capital. Because of course it's not for us in the EU to take a view as to where things should be located. We take note, of course, of these specialization strategies that are emerging and that on which the Baltic states indeed are trying to make use of the tool set that the European Union provides, and that's fine. But it's important to see that we will not manage this in a way by having priority areas. On the contrary, we will be bottom-up in our approach in terms of sectors, again, because we want to be able to pick the right innovations, and that should come from the research side and not from top-down from our angle. And second, of course, we will remain neutral as to where they are. Actually, we will try as much as we can to facilitate the reinforcement of the local ecosystems, and therefore not to attach a premium to the fact that you're located in Berlin, Paris, or this, I would say, larger ecosystem with a lot of greater financial means.
Okay, thank you. So in a way, you're trying to facilitate and guide this risk process. Mr. LUBI, you wanted to reply to that.
I just, I was actually quite surprised to see the response from the audience to a question that people are not very, let's say, happy to take risks. So if I may rephrase the question, how many of you would be happy if the government takes the risk?
All hands up.
Only a very few.
No.
So the
Only
thing
few.
is that we're just discussing that governments need to take risks, so that as you don't want us to take risks, so we are doomed. That I don't know what you really advise to my minister, saying that, I think you should take risks, but why the audience doesn't want us to take risks? So I think this is a huge dilemma we really need to take. So that's why the question also that what are our, let's say, priorities? Or it has to be middle ground, meaning that, it has to be driven by market forces. But at the same time, I still, despite the fact that the audience was not very, let's say, supportive, I think, we should take risks also.
Okay. First, Mr. ROJAKA, and then Stéphane wants to reply again.
Pretty much in line with the same concept. I actually believe that those people who didn't raise their hands, they are taking risk. They're taking risk of being not innovative enough or not risky enough, which is already kind of our adverse investment. So I believe that it is very important. And regarding the governmental risk, I believe that the government should take higher risk, especially by creating the ecosystem of new thinking, ecosystem of new startups, and the traditional businesses also that should change their current situation to the qualitative different level.
Okay, and in that way, the innovation becomes either a shared burden or failure, or a shared success, of course.
I believe it's first shared burden and then shared success.
Very good, thank you. Stéphane.
Yeah, no, I wanted to say that the risk level usually in finance is strongly correlated to the reward that you can expect from your investment. So individuals will have a different point of around that curve where they are ready to make that trade-off. In other words, basically, because of the high risk level, are able to hand over potentially a lot of the rewards from their activities to an investor. And I think that what we're trying to do here, again, at European level, I totally agree with you, it is the role of the government, it is the role of public authorities to take more risk in a targeted manner, and when really it makes sense, not crowding out the private investors, but on the contrary, trying to crowd them in order to bring private money alongside us. But basically what we're trying to do here is to take a significant part of the risk, but leaving intact as much as possible the rewards for the private sector to actually then operate and define new markets. So it's a particularly difficult niche to find, but this is where it makes sense, of course, for us to come in and intervene at that level.
Exactly. Ms. Rojaka, quick reaction?
Just totally agree that facilitation for the private sector to participate in the risk process is very favorable for both sides, actually. Because when we compare EU with the other regions where we are lagging behind by innovative products or criteria, we see that the public level of investment is pretty much on the same level, but the private is the problem. So in the private sector in EU doesn't want or is not, the environment is not favorable enough for investments.
Exactly, and that needs to change. Mr. EGLITIS?
Well, I would kind of like to remind another dimension, a little dimension on this kind of risk-taking. There is also a gap between the risk-taking in terms of more mature countries and new countries. And one of the kind of not very comfortable thing to see is, for example, Horizon projects. Yeah, when these are getting evaluated, we are seeing that decision-making is rather risk-averse in terms of engagement more of the new countries, small projects, small businesses into this process. So we would be expecting from the small countries' perspective, of course, bigger risk-taking in that respect from the EU.
Okay, thank you.
We're trying to change that.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to open up the floor to you as well. So just checking if there's a question from your side for either the whole panel or one of the panelists.
Policy making is too
You really
complicated
don't like
thing.
to take a risk of asking a question? Well, then we'll just continue the panel. I think one of the points that were mentioned at the beginning is the importance of skills. We've already heard that it's very important to start at the higher education level to make some changes. But shouldn't we take into account the whole education sector? Should we already start at primary education level to make this change? And what kind of skills are then required that those youngsters should already learn? Be happy to have your take on that. Mr. LUBI?
Yes. I think the clear answer, yes, education is the key, but it's a very long-term strategy anyway. I think we all, three of us at least in the Baltic states, have done a tremendous job in that. We know it, we have pushed it. It's not just that we have been in a wait-and-see position, actually we have managed it well. I have to say it's not the primary education, it's much later, but I'm extremely impressed by Lithuania sending their interns to NASA, for example. I think it's extremely wise, and these kind of programs should be supported because the value that eventually Lithuania gets from this program, I think, we cannot underestimate it, and you will see the fruits later, obviously. So education is very important, even that, again, taking the risks. I think that maybe government, with just an idea that government should support that every student, with the support of the government, should go and study abroad at least a year, so that we should support sending our youngsters outside to see the world. Because one thing I think that has changed, and you really need to realize that it has changed. Our competition is not regional. It hasn't been regional for a long time. Our competition is global, already for a long time. So that if we see only what's happening here, it's not sustainable, and we will be in trouble very, very soon.
Okay, we'll come back to the global competition part later on. Mr. EGLITIS.
Well, if we dive a little deeper in education, absolutely the whole system needs to be kind of revamped, and it has to address the modern necessities. In Latvian situation in particular, we have realized that we've been for too long time kind of higher education biased. We kind of think that every young person needs to go through the higher education system. which is actually not necessary. In many cases, we understand that if we create the modern professional education system, that can be a very good parallel path of the development and education, including the technology, because very much of the technology development is getting commoditized very quickly. Yeah? In my age, yes, you were taught programming in the university. Nowadays, you can start doing that in the primary school. Yep. So many technical resources can be achieved. Improvement can be achieved through the professional education. And one more thing, definitely, is we have to get more focused also in the adult education. The lifelong education has to become more mainstream.
Exactly, as well as the reskilling that you've already mentioned. Mr. ROJAKA.
As already said, the skills is a cornerstone for innovative process itself. And if we want to see some kind of favorable outcome, we definitely need to put more attention to reskilling. And there's reskilling and skills overall, all over. If we take a look on what is the top 3 skills, the 2 of them across the countries, whether it is European Union or Lithuania itself, or China or United States, would be creativity and leadership. And that what should be taught to some extent in the families, at school, in the kindergartens, so in very early stages. And what we definitely need to implement is this design thinking, you know, that for the students, for the younger people to be able to think in this circle, from idea to implementation and to monetization of this idea. I believe that it is very important for our all success.
Okay, so this design thinking approach would be something quite novel, because that brings along a whole different way of thinking, of looking at education.
Absolutely.
It's about reiteration, go, no go, take failure into account as well.
And it's very important that the students would know that not in theory only, but also practically. So practical needs and practical skills are very important in this kind of rigid sphere, because education is kind of rigid. Otherwise, it wouldn't be such a problem for any country.
Exactly. Mr. LUBI, you would
Yes,
like to
I
add
just
something?
wanted to add that, I think, we should help communities to be built. What I mean by that, in Estonia we have a very good example set by the startup community. 2 things they are doing. The Estonian startup community is growing very fast. First thing, startup community is a community in this sense that they really help others to fail well. So they are catching you. If the rest of society is built on the same principles, that failure is okay, I think the risk-taking will also follow. Because the startup community really, if you fall, we help you to stand up and try again. Second thing about skills, and we see that also the startup community has taken initiative, and they have started their own programs and with their own money to train people, young people, to do things that are needed in their lives. So the founders of our unicorns, they all have invested their time and money to education that is completely away from their field of business. But this kind of community approach has been extremely beneficial.
Okay, thank you. So Stefan, we learned about education being a foundation. There can be some adaptations, need to work on our skills. But I'm sure as the European Commission, you want to fund the greatest ideas. So do we need more people to come up with creative ideas in their garage, for example, like Steve Jobs did? Or what do you expect? What would you like to have?
Well, I mean, of course, if we have more people coming with innovative ideas, all the better for Europe, all the better for the Baltic countries. And I think that I'm not a specialist of education system, which, by the way, remains the responsibility of the member states. So I'm not going to comment on that. But I think that indeed it is part of the equation in order to improve the performance of Europe, across the board. Well, nevertheless, we in Europe are not so bad at generating good ideas, at generating creative ideas. If you look at the number of young companies, for example, being created, you will see that Europe is actually doing better than the US in the overall number of young companies being created. So Europeans indeed go into entrepreneurship, they take risks, they create companies, they have good ideas that they want to bring to the market, but then often they don't find the necessary support to grow their companies. because often they face a number of regulatory barriers or obstacles, bureaucratic and otherwise, and but mainly also the difficulties to access finance. And I think this is the type of issues that we tend to prioritize now in order to try to address the lack of, I would say, market-creating companies at European level, to make this transition from the moment very good people, very smart brains have great creative ideas and they start with their companies out of that, but then they stall and often they don't manage to get the necessary support in order to accelerate the growth of their company and make a real change. Often what they do, as everybody knows, they migrate, they go somewhere else where the opportunities for growth are better because the access to finance is far better than in Europe, and the overall environment for their ideas to flourish is indeed better. So we need to try to address on this overall environment, regulatory and otherwise, but also to fundamentally address the access to finance issue, not because we want to absolutely keep protectively our smart ideas in Europe, but because we would like very much to get, I would say, a bigger share of the output that these ideas are creating and not find ourselves in the situation 10 or 20 years from now we will have to buy goods and services from companies located somewhere else in the world, because that would mean that the added value created by these companies will be flowing to another tax system and not necessarily being plugged back into our European system. And this is where I think all European countries are now mindful of the challenge and are trying to address it.
Exactly. So the challenge will be definitely to turn knowledge, the creativity that we have already and those ideas into money. It sounds pretty easy, doesn't it? Okay, we don't have a lot of time anymore, but I'd like to know from you, and that's something that you alluded to, Mr. LUBI, global competition. We can think we're doing very well in Europe, but of course we need to see this in a more global perspective. So are you worried about the rise of, for example, China, South Korea?
I don't think we should worry about that other countries are rising. We should worry that we don't rise fast enough alongside. Global competition is definitely harsh, and we have our issues we have to solve. I would also say that there are many opportunities. This is the biggest difference between public sector and private sector usually. Public sector usually sees challenges. Private sector sees opportunities. So I think we also should think in terms of opportunities. And it's all about talent. I think Europe is in a very good position to compete globally because we have the talent. Yeah. And talent is there. We just need core groups to be, emerging that really create this kind of innovation that can compete globally. And I wouldn't say that talent and mobility of talent is an issue. The talent is already extremely mobile. And what you said, that the talent goes where all the opportunities lie. And therefore, we shouldn't focus on talent so much because market failure is not there. But we have two areas where we have a market failure in Europe. One is money and one is data. Money issue, Commission thankfully right now is extremely forceful, that creating also VC capital that is trans-European and so on. I think it's extremely important. But money supply has to be there. Second one, even more crucial, is data. Yeah. Data doesn't move freely across borders. And right now, data is horizontal issue across the sectors. If we cannot make data move freely across the borders, we are doomed.
Okay, thank you for your contribution. We don't have much more time to run into a discussion on data because that would have been a nice add-on, but unfortunately time is up. So I'd just like to have a yes or no. Are you worried about China, South Korea being a threat? Yes, no?
I'm worried more about us being competitive with other regions, but definitely we need to look on the inputs and outputs, and in both categories, EU is lagging behind. So what we definitely need, and we see also, as has been already mentioned, that we see that profits from European startups has been, some of the best startups end up in the crown of Chinese or United States conglomerate, and you can't solve that with the protectionism. So what we definitely need is better environment for them to stay in Europe and to attract new talents
Okay,
to Europe.
okay. I'm just going to ask you to answer with yes or no. China, South Korea, a threat?
Well, a couple of words still. Even UK needs to understand that compared to China, they are a small market.
Yeah.
So our challenge is for Europe to stay together.
Perfect. Stefan?
Well, yes and no.
Yes and no. Well, you leave the audience for sure with some thoughts. Final question to you, and I'd like to know from you in one word, what is your wish to all those innovators here in the audience? One word. I know, I'm going to be yes, I'm very strict. Stefan already knows this.
So let's start from Stefan. One word.
One word, Stefan. What is your wish for innovators here?
Success.
Success?
Wish.
Thank you.
One word. Oh, I challenge the audience. Risk-taking.
Try.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, a big hand to our panel.